Shabbat Shalom. We have reached the time of the plagues, and as such we have, well, I hope we have, some certain ethical quandaries that are percolating within you. Most famous, of course, is the question of Pharaoh hardening his heart. We're not going to get into that one today, although I'll be happy to carry that conversation into the Kiddush luncheon. But the one that I would like to point out that is going to be perhaps most poignant is the fact that the plagues are not only targeted against Pharaoh. Yes, Pharaoh is the main adversary for Moses and for Aaron, technically the main adversary of God, but it is the entire nation of Egypt that suffers from his intransigence, from his refusal to let us go, and for the consequences of his decision regarding the enslavement of our people and the murdering of our children. Is that fair? Is it fair that the entire nation of Egypt is going to suffer, beginning with the first plague and going all the way through into the dramatic conclusion where we see the slaying of the firstborn, just because one guy at the top of the pyramid is making a lot of bad decisions? What do you got to initially get us going?
Well, I think it's because Pharaoh cherished the people and not the Israelites, and the people have persecuted the Israelites. What is Pharaoh?
So the people, well, they were involved in the enslavement. Right? It's not as though only Pharaoh was involved here. They were alongside. They kind of sort of benefited from it. So therefore, if they benefit from the profit that our labor brought them, then they should also suffer the consequences of that decision. Did you have something?
You actually said what I was going to ask.
Okay.
They benefited from it, so it was fair because of their passive participation.
Their passive participation. And this is indeed the usual explanation for the suffering of the Egyptians. First of all, commentators will point out that although the Egyptians suffer through the plagues, no one dies until the very end. That the plagues are not mortal up until the very last plague. Prior to that, there is a whole lot of suffering, but there isn't actually any death. And therefore, they suffer because they passively participated and benefited from the slavery, and that seems perfectly fine. But we're still left with that final plague where they finally die. I mean, is passively participating in something a capital offense these days? That's a crime? So let's look at some of the commentary that tries to unravel a little bit more of the complicity of the average Egyptians, not just Pharaoh, to understand the concept of justice that is being played out here, and perhaps draw our own conclusions and guidance for ourselves. So the enslavement of the Israelites happens in stages. The first stage, of course, that we have talked about here just now is that they are enslaved, that we go from being guests within the country to being captives within the country. We go from those who were contributing through our effort to Egypt to those who are now forced to work for the betterment of Egypt, the making of the bricks, the building of cities, etc. But that was not the only stage, because that was there to suppress us, as we talked about last week, to make sure that we wouldn't rise up and join any enemies of Egypt, and it didn't work. And so what was stage two? What was stage two? If enslavement didn't slow us down, what came next? Killing the boys. But let's break that down, because we usually gloss over this because it is such a horrible, horrible concept. But when we read the Torah carefully, we see that it actually breaks down into three different stages of the killing of those boys. The first stage was to approach the midwives. Pharaoh tells the midwives, you go, and when the woman gives birth, you check. And if it looks like it's a boy, then make an accident happen. Make an accident happen. I mean, lots of things go wrong at birth. Babies die all the time in birth, so do women, especially back in the day. So just, take the boys out and let the girls live. Indeed, when you read it carefully, it does seem like Pharaoh is working on a more secret plot at this point. He is not saying, everybody kill the boys. He is just saying, hey, midwives, let's just ixnay on the oisbe, right? Just take them out. The mothers don't even have to know that you did anything. And this way we will diminish the population of threatening males, and everything will be fine, and no one's going to get upset, and no one's going to cause any trouble. And of course, the midwives famously are like, oh, sorry, Pharaoh. Oh, we'd love to help you with that whole mass murder thing, but, these Israelite women, they're not like the Egyptian women. They're like animals. They just have babies wherever they feel like it. They don't come in for the niceties of the birthing stool. They're just out popping them out in the field because, well, you know what they're like. And Pharaoh buys it. And the midwives save many, many babies by not complying with his demand, by having this passive civil disobedience, by playing off his own built-in prejudices to imagine that Pharaoh would buy this line of argument, and it works. That was stage one. Stage two, Pharaoh's not done with this idea. Stage two is, all right, then we're going to have to kill them more directly. So much for discreet, so much for subtle. We are going to go in guns blazing. And fortune tellers he works with say, indeed, Pharaoh, here's how you need to do it. Because they have cast the star charts, and they have seen that a redeemer for the Israelites is indeed about to arise, and that redeemer will meet his end at water. And therefore, they decide to throw the children into the water. Recognize that that is a choice. We take it for granted because we've read this so often, we've said it in the Haggadah, we have gone over and over in the movies about throwing the children into the river, but honestly, what kind of execution plan is that? Right, there's much better ways to kill someone than chuck them in a river. Even the Nile with all of its crocodiles, there are better ways to do this. The Midrash says it is because those astrologers had decided that the Redeemer of Israel would meet his end at the river, at the water, and therefore, boom, this was the best way to ensure that the Israelites would never be redeemed. Now, just as an aside, the astrologers were right. But how did our Redeemer meet his end? Anybody know what happens later in the story, 40 years from now? Bang on the rock, Moses. And the water comes out, and at that moment, as his actions are reprehensible, that's a whole other conversation for Bamidbar, he loses his ability to enter into the land of Israel and passes away shortly thereafter. So they were right. He did meet his end at water, but it wasn't the Nile that was going to be his problem. And in fact, this sets up the entire process by which he comes into the household of Pharaoh himself and rises to become Moses and redeemed. So it's one of those great examples of literary prophecies where they had it right in the large version, but they got all the details wrong. And by putting it into action, they actually created the circumstances that would make it come true. Self-fulfilling prophecy at its best. But how did this work? How did the throwing of the children into the river work? Well, ostensibly, the decree went out, hear ye, all Israelite women, when you have children, throw the boys in the river. And then it all just happens, right? Really? We think that the Israelite women are just going to go along with this? That they're just going to be perfectly fine? Nobody's going to object? No one's going to have any problem? No, says our sages. This only worked because the Egyptians participated. The Egyptians kept size, and they said, hey, she looks pregnant. Let me make a few notes in my diary and come back to her in a few months and see where the baby is. Hey, I found out the baby is a boy. Police, we got a boy over here, needs to be killed. The Egyptians were at the very least informants against all the Israelites in this circumstance. Without their active participation, this could never have worked. You do not have enough enforcement agents to be able to keep track of every single pregnancy unless there are others that are willing to participate. Remember, this is before the days when people had easy medical databases to scan. This required eyes on, and those eyes were coming from Egyptian neighbors. Those eyes were coming from the others. And perhaps maybe a few overzealous Egyptians got into the act. After all, it was the law, and helped put some of those children into the Nile. But that's only stage 2. Stage 3, says our Midrash, is that Pharaoh says that we need to make all the children, all the boys, go into the river. And the Midrash says, well, what could that possibly mean? He's already said that the Israelite boys have to go into the river. What does he mean, all the boys? Well, Pharaoh became concerned. After all, this Redeemer that the astrologers had foretold, nobody said it had to be an Israelite Redeemer. What if an Egyptian? What if an Egyptian was going to free the slaves? Well, the only way to make sure that didn't happen was for all the babies to go into the water. Every child, every boy born to an Israelite or to an Egyptian was murdered. Because how else are you going to be sure? So you see these stages. We had the secret plan. The secret plan turned into the overt plan with the complicit active participation by the Egyptians. And eventually the Egyptians were killing their own children right alongside our own in order to ensure that we would remain slaves. This is a lot more than just passive acceptance of the benefits of our slavery. The Egyptians were active, willing participants, not only in our enslavement, but also the murder of our children, up to and including being willing to kill their own in order to keep us as their slaves. Now, you might be thinking, Rabbi, this sounds a little bit like a far-fetched midrash. Come on, really? Anyone's going to kill their own kid? Well, certainly we have seen large numbers of people who would rather their children die than become something that they hate. Better dead than red. Better dead than gay. Better dead than marry that person. Honor killings continue to happen throughout the world. But we have evidence from within the Egyptian story itself. Remember that final plague, the killing of the firstborn. Did you ever stop and wonder, when the firstborn heard about this plague, whether they were a little alarmed? After all the other plagues were generic. Everybody is getting boils. Everybody is dealing with the hail. Firstborn sounds awfully targeted if I am a firstborn, which thankfully I'm not. And maybe they would go to Pharaoh and say, hey, Pharaoh, how about we decide to let these people go before I know I will die? Maybe now that it's hitting the fan, we finally should give in, because so far God is 9 for 9. And with the promise of number 10 affecting me directly, I'm not so sure that we should put this one to the test. And indeed, the Midrash says that's exactly what happened. That the firstborn got together a delegation and they went, not just to Pharaoh, but to their own families, and said, we have to change Pharaoh's mind. We have to let the Israelites go, because if not, I'll die. And their family said, better you should die than we let them go. I would rather you were dead than we allow them to win. This was the mentality. And the firstborn, according to the Midrash, based upon the book of Psalms, which says that God struck Egypt through the firstborn, not struck the firstborn of Egypt, but struck Egypt through the firstborn, that the firstborn actually rose up in revolt prior to that final plague and attacked their families, who were willing to sacrifice them in order to maintain the Egyptian superiority over our people. And of course, after they had killed many of their families, then the plague comes and they themselves die as well. So it's a double whammy for the people of Egypt. And then and only then does Pharaoh relent momentarily to allow us to leave, which of course he quickly regrets, and then leads even more to die in the sea, fulfilling the perfect cycle that those who had killed by water die by water, as they drowned themselves in the sea, pursuing only out of their sense of hate and out of their sense of they had to win at all costs, even if it meant losing. The perversion of that thought process continues to astound me, and yet it continues to be echoed in nations around the world. Country after country, look only most recently to Iran, is willing to shoot their own citizens in order to maintain their sense of authority, willing to murder people in the streets in order to maintain their dominance in that place. How many do I need to kill in order to ensure that I can continue to reign over their graves? It is not so far-fetched at all. I know sometimes the Midrashim feel like our ancestors were stretching the text in order to make a certain point, and in certain places they might have been. But it's worth noting the point they are making is still a relevant point. That there is no such thing as being a passive participant in mass slaughter. There is no such thing as I wasn't involved when it happened next door. Everyone, anywhere, is responsible for what is going on around them. According to Jewish law, if a person has the opportunity to protest and chooses not to, they are liable for what comes next. What about the 2-year-olds? So, we get into the question of what happens to those that were too young to be involved in protest. The infants that might have also been caught up in this horrible slaughter. And indeed, we have to weep at the reverberations of their families' decisions. There is another teaching within Judaism that when the sword of the plague comes out, it will also strike the innocent. That there are certain things that once they have been set in motion, there cannot be, it's impossible to discriminate. The most famous, of course, are diseases and such, where we do not expect that the righteous will be spared, their infection that is spreading throughout a community. But war and plagues such as these likewise will affect even those that were not directly involved. But their parents were. Their families were. Their neighbors, their relatives, and certainly everyone else that they would have known was involved and were complicit. And that means that as it unfolds, this catastrophe, after a year's worth of warning, after multiple uprisings within their own group, yes, we can weep for the death of those innocents, but we cannot feel that we are responsible for it. Because ultimately the crime was the original sin was the crime of enslavement and murder that happened at their hands. And at a certain point, after a year of protest, after hundreds of years of enslavement, there will be a catastrophe in the waiting that is going to unfold. And as we can see, that catastrophe only barely was able to secure the release of our people at all. God forbid it had failed and more extreme measures had been needed. But if we want our 2-year-olds to live, if we want our neighbors to live, we can't sit by quietly regarding any issue that we see that is carrying on the theme of Pharaoh's despotism. We do not have the luxury of saying, it's not my problem. I'm not responsible. I'm not participating. That is not what it is to be a human being, and it's certainly not what it is to be a community. So as such, we stand with those who stand against the Iranian government, who stand against the Russian government, who stand against any government that would murder its own citizens in order to maintain its authority. And we will do all we can to ensure that people are able to experience the gift of freedom that the story of the Exodus promises to everyone. Shabbat Shalom.